Okay, so thanks everybody. It's great to see you all here for our second plenary discussion during the gathering today. And of course, today we're joined by Michael Sacasas, who prepared a lecture for us that I hope everybody's been able to watch. I know, Michael, we had several discussions about this and there was a lot of energy and interest in engaging with you. So we're really looking forward to this. Michael is the Associate Director of the Christian Studies Center in Gainesville, Florida, although he's coming to us today from Miami. And he's the author of the Convivial Society, which is a newsletter about technology and society that you may want to look up and subscribe to. So, Michael, welcome to the Ecclesia Project. It's great to have you here. I wanted to, you can't unmute yourself. Okay, I can see that. Can we fix that? Let me also, by the way, that reminds me to tell everybody else how this is going to work. In theory, Michael and I can talk. That's going to happen. For the duration of our exchange, you guys will be muted just to avoid awkward background noise appearing, and you'll be able to chat directly to the host. We do want to get everybody into the conversation, so the plan is that Michael and I will be talking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll go over to questions. So if, as we're talking, you think of something you want to ask a question about, send that in the chat to the host, who is Danny Fong today. And Danny will be collecting those, and then as we get about 40 minutes in, we'll start bringing other people in so that we can broaden out the conversation to everybody else. Okay. So chat your questions in. Feel free if you want to use your little reaction buttons as well. This would be hilarious to see your thumbs up and your applause and whatever you want to, whatever kinds of responses you want. As much as possible, we'd like to have you in this conversation as well. So, hi Michael, can you talk now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you, just to get started, how did you get interested in writing about technology and Christian faith? Like, was there something that happened, a moment or a story where you realized you really had something you wanted to say or something you wanted to think about?
I don't know if it was a moment per se, but there was a book, at least, I think, that I can point to in my seminary years. This is around 2001, maybe even a little bit earlier. And it was Craig Gay's The Way of the Modern World. Craig Gay is a sociologist at Regent University, I think. And the premise of the book is that we have our professed beliefs, but we do a poor job of living according to them. And so that there's a source of moral and spiritual formation that isn't just about aligning our worldview along certain propositional beliefs or just believing the right things, that there's another place where our moral and spiritual formation was taking place. And so he looked, as a good sociologist would, to social structures, and some of those were economic, some of those were political, and then some of those were technological. And I think that's the first place where I began to recognize and realize how powerfully formative this material infrastructure of our life can be. And so I think from that point forward, that was an underlying interest for me. I carried that out of seminary and eventually into a PhD program that wasn't exactly about those sorts of questions. It was a program called Text and Technology at the University of Central Florida. But those were certainly the questions that I continued to carry into my research and my writing. And then I began writing, honestly, as a way to just sort of think out loud or think in public, as it were, as I was going through my PhD program. This was around 2009, 2010. And the blog turned into the newsletter and writing in various outlets, and then eventually being invited to talk and speak in front of churches and groups like this and other settings. So it was all very sort of ad hoc over the years, and but it's been great, and I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, we're glad to have you here. I think I'm aware that people may have watched the recorded talk a while ago, so I just want to be sure we've kind of got everybody's synapses firing afresh. So I'm going to take a stab. There's a lot in this talk. but I'm going to take a stab, and you can tell me how I do at sort of summarizing some high points, right? So one of the things that really struck me in the beginning is that you distinguish we can, and it's important to think about particular devices and tools and how they're affecting us, but that what you really kind of wanted to shift our attention to in the talk was thinking about the technological culture that we live in, right? The sort of the bigger frame, not just the tools, but the bigger frame, and how those are forming us. And then you describe this as sort of there are two ways then that coming out of scriptural stories, two ways that we're living. One is the path of Cain, coming out of the garden, coping with the fall by learning to control, right? And possess and build security. And you call this the path of mastery. And then there's the path of grace, which is also about being a fallen creature, but recognizing the limits of control and looking for gift and being open to being a fallen creature in a world that's owned by God, right? Or owned, maybe not the right word there. Anyway, so this is, and then you do a lot of really interesting work about describing this technological culture we live in, especially the way it shapes us for consumerism and makes the world, this was one of the phrases that really caught my attention, makes the world into a point of aggression, right? So that everything is to be measured and controlled and optimized. And this makes the path of grace much harder for us, just living in that kind of frame. Okay, how am I doing?
Great, and I'll note that phrase, turn the world into a series of points of aggression, is Harmut Rosa's phrase. And as soon as I read it in his wonderful little book, The Uncontrollability of the World, it resonated and struck me as a really apt way of describing just how we sort of set up our day-to-day experience and what it feels like to be alive in this mode that we tend to inhabit. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, there's more about how you end, but we can come
Sure.
to talking about how you end this a little later. I kind of wanted to jump in at the deep end,
Sure.
if you're okay with that, right?
Yeah.
So a really difficult point comes up kind of late in the talk, where you're talking about the path of mastery. And the problem that in a fallen world, when we're trying to act in compassion, it can be hard to tell, are we developing tools that are acts of that this is about compassion, we're meeting the needs of a fallen world, or is this kind of the path of mastery, an improper seizing of control and domination? And you admit that this is a really dicey thing, and that you don't entirely know how to make that distinction. Yeah. But and you guys who are watching, I did warn Michael about this. Here's my really hard question. I was thinking about the time period we've just come out of, and there was this big division in the church between people who said, at least in my community, people who said wearing masks, shutting down live church services, that's like excessive kind of mastery. That's driven by fear. That's refusing to let God be in control of our worship, and relying on this kind of technology that shuts down our openness to each other. So some people went the route of saying we need to keep going to church together as an act of faith, and then there were other people who adopted safer forms of worship that do, alleviate or reduce some kind of serendipity and the contact and all that. So I wondered if you could kind of unfold for us something about how you would read that in light of this this temptation to the path of mastery.
Yeah, I think so. The first thing that comes to my mind with regards to anything COVID related is that there's this dimension of the degree to which it became sort of swallowed up by the culture wars, and became not only an issue of varying degrees of prudence that we might exercise, or competing moral claims about risk and openness to surprise and what amount of risk we're able to sustain. But what you did, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, in some circles became equivalent to signaling whether you were on the left or the right. And so there was this sort of political dimension that I think also complicated matters even further, and I think made our ability to think together profitably about the choices before us very difficult. So acknowledging that, I think that there was a way of recognizing that love for our neighbor in the context of a pandemic of the sort that we were experiencing might require us to adjust, to adapt, to find creative ways of retaining some of the in-person contact that we would have had. And of course, location would determine a great deal of what was possible in those contexts. What might have been possible for me here in Florida may not have been possible in Michigan in the winter of 2020, right? But so many of these things, I think, I'm almost tempted to say the same sort of response on the surface could arise from two very different motivations. And a lot of what mattered would have been going on at that deeper level of what is motivating it. So I can see someone, I'm in the Presbyterian tradition, so I can see a session of a local church deciding to go online for their services for a period of time because they recognize that there is a threat to the livelihood of others. It's a very real threat. It's a clear and present threat. And they're not motivated by fear. They're motivated by love, right? They're motivated genuinely by compassion. And so they take this action. And then I can imagine being on a different session that takes the same exact action, but they are motivated out of fear. They're motivated by a low view of the necessity of church. So, well, sure, we meet in person, we can meet online. It's the same difference. And so the same actions could have come, I think, out of very different motivations or sense of what was important, what was valuable. And I think a lot of these questions are dicey because what I feel is at issue is what is going on within, what may not be apparent in the form of the decision that arises out of the inner turmoil or the inner motives. And so the defining point for me, I think, is to not act out of fear, to not simply try to master controls. So if we're acting out of fear, right, and our standard is something like 100% certainty that there is going to be no danger in our gathering together, to me that's a standard that is incompatible with life in a fallen world where we are not masters of our circumstances. And so, I can see how you can even begin with appropriate concern for your neighbor, for the well-being of your parishioners, especially the elderly. And then very subtly, perhaps, that turns into something a little bit different where you become altogether uncomfortable with any kind of risk. And so then there are also the political questions of what the civil authorities are requiring of you. And so that added, I think, another dimension that became very contentious. And so that it's, Ivan Illich is my North Star in many of these matters. And I think one of the things I mentioned at the end of the talk, I think that Illich makes a great deal of sort of the Good Samaritan. And the point that he draws from that is that you have the gospel opens up an arena of freedom that didn't exist before to respond to a call. And in his view, that call is distinct from a set of prescriptions about what one must do, right? And so what I would have ideally, I think, would have wanted to see is that there's a great deal of latitude within different Christian communities and traditions to respond to the call. That is to assess the needs that are particular to their communities, particular to the neighborhoods in which they live, to the particular demographics of their church, and faithfully seek to love one's neighbor and at the same time be cognizant of the fact that we live in a fallen condition, and we cannot simply be motivated by a desire to avoid all risks entirely, and let our lives be driven by that. So I'm not sure if that's a very helpful answer, but I think that's how I begin to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, and I take your point about the culture wars being there's another kind of dynamic around this as well. I don't know, as you were talking about that, it reminded me that this summer there's been this difficulty getting ourselves to go back, even knowing that it's relatively safe now or fully vaccinated, and for a lot of us coming to the point where we can go back into that space is there's a difficult transition there.
Yeah, and I think that, I've observed with some friends in conversation that early on it seemed in the pandemic that it was hard to get some people to take the thing seriously. That seemed to be the challenge, right? At least there were those even within the circles where it eventually was taken very seriously. Early on, the reaction was no big deal, and now it seems that in some cases it's hard to convince people that this might actually end, right? That things might become safe again. But and I think the news media, to some degree, I think has a role to play in this, in the sense that the headlines tend to highlight the uncertainty, or even the framing of the appearance of a new variant with regards to vaccine efficacy seems to stress the most negative possible way of conceiving of the relationship. So that generates fear and a greater degree of uncertainty. And so it has, I think, generated now kind of, we now have an opposite sort of situation in some circles. Now, of course, there are those that may still go on thinking that we experienced that this was all contrived. But I think that there are now some that I think do need to consider whether things are not safer than they imagine in some regards. And again, these are such personal decisions in some cases. So my own family, as an example, my wife is unvaccinated because of prior history of very severe allergic reactions. I'm vaccinated, and so we negotiate. What we're comfortable with. It cannot just be what I'm comfortable with. It has some degree to do with what she's comfortable with, but also trying to think very clearly about what the present situation is, and sort of thermostatically adjusting, our behaviors according to the the best evidence that we have, and again, understanding that 100% certainty about the impossibility of infection isn't an achievable goal.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I mean, it occurred to me this question about compassion was really kind of an interesting one in that context. Can I take a whole different direction with this path of mastery thing?
Yeah, certainly.
So a number of us know or have been connected to Willie James Jennings' work, and the word mastery, right, clicks off a different set of associations there, that he uses that to talk about whiteness, right? And it sounded very similar to what you were saying, that there is this this habit, this expectation of being in control, of being the owner, of having maybe even an obligation to dominate the world for the sake of everybody else. Mm-hmm. And so, and even, the story of the invention of racism in colonial era, right? Christians traveled around the world using their new technology and optimize, return, find ways to master and control, and sometimes claiming this for the sake of the gospel. Mm-hmm. I don't know, can you help us think some about the way this technological culture we're in, forming us toward mastery and control, has some connections to racism? I don't know if that's something that you've thought about, or you can help us to think through.
I think the first thing that comes to mind is that undoubtedly, certainly throughout the 19th century and to some degree before that, there is an important move that I think happens in modern sort of European thought, where technology becomes synonymous with technological superiority, more or less becomes synonymous with intellectual and moral superiority. In other words, a superior technological set of tools became a way of assuming that one's culture was superior, right? So out of the European context, and to some degree later even the North American context, the tools of European modernity both became implements of colonialization and subjugation, of material extraction of resources from colonial societies, but also a way of for the colonizers to sort of assert their own superiority. We are superior in part because, and evidenced by, our technological superiority. And so that the tools became, very literally sort of certifiers of colonialism, and to the degree that they allowed those who wielded them to imagine themselves as being morally superior. I think of that even in more recent contexts, right? Under the idea of development, right? Of the so-called developed and undeveloped world, and then the push for development in the mid 20th century. Again, Ivan Illich was a searing critic of the idea of development, which to him was just a way of importing into not yet industrial societies all the pathologies of industrial society, and an unwillingness to recognize the integrity and the goodness of existing technocultural configurations in indigenous societies. And so that even in the late 20th century, under a different guise, not necessarily the guise of conquest or literal conquest in the way that we might have thought of it in the 19th century, but a kind of economic hegemony that was sustained by the desire to import Western technologies, the sort of the Western technological, techno-economic set, as it were, into non-Western societies, and that this would be good for them, right? Without respect to what their genuine needs were, to whether they were being, in fact, exploited, to whatever the consequences of so-called development would have been in those societies, and even in the face of evidence that there were deleterious consequences for these societies. The assumption was simply that this was just the better way of life, right? That the techno-economic package of Western modernity was what everyone must aspire to. And so we do good by importing it by whatever means to other societies. And so I think technology has always been a part of the way that Western societies have imposed themselves on other societies from the early modern period, certainly through the 20th century. And then the military dimension of this, of course, is the most, perhaps the most obvious way in which this has been manifested.
Yeah. Wow, that opens up a whole other can of worms. But doesn't it?
Yeah.
Note to the listeners: write your questions in the chat. So thinking about this, ways that people from the Ecclesia Project kind of connected right away to this idea of path of mastery as something different than specific devices. One of the things that right away came up was techniques of assessment in congregations. Is this something that rings a bell for you in terms of kind of an example of how that works
right
in congregations? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so I tend to use the word technique. Well, at least I usually, when I use the word technique, have Jacques Ellul back of mind, right? And so Ellul uses the term in a very distinct way, not simply to mean, what, when we might think of, a dancer or a musical performer learning a new technique on an instrument in this very narrow sense, but technique for Ellul just becomes the defining value of modern societies. And what it generally amounts to is the desire to make everything measurable and as efficient as possible. And so efficiency itself becomes the defining value, right? Or whatever can be measured becomes the defining value. And I think this is the danger for churches, that in using maybe in the church growth movement, for example, now maybe 2-3 decades prior to the present, there was this. It seemed very easy to slide into the idea that the larger your congregation, the more successful a pastor you were. Right. This is a very, seemingly crude formulation of it, but I think it was one that was hard to escape. And so it's very difficult to measure the care of souls. It's very difficult to measure sanctification. But it's very easy to measure church attendance on a Sunday morning, right? And it is very difficult to achieve spiritual growth, right? By what in the Reformed tradition are known as the ordinary means of grace, right? Which are not spectacular, very difficult to predict. They may not yield immediate results or evident results. But if you can apply techniques to the growth of a congregation, right? And marketing becomes a part of this picture. So wherever a measurable goal comes to dominate the way that a specific congregation thinks about their health, their spiritual health, I think that's when we've tipped over into what I would, from my perspective, would be a very dangerous place. And so if we think of church growth or even spiritual health as being subject to a method or a technique, and that the technique is somehow necessarily efficacious, right? That if you read your Bible an hour in the morning for 40 consecutive days, this will produce, quantifiable, identifiable results. That's and again, it's good to read. You should read your Bible, perhaps, every morning. That's fine, right? But that becomes a method or a technique to bring about spiritual growth. Or again, in the context of the church, that your yearly budget or that your church attendance or the number of small groups, these quantifiable realities of church life become the measurement of health, is what I think we should resist.
Yeah, because in one of the discussions we had, somebody was like, but technique is good, right? And training is good. If you want to get trained in musical technique, then
Sure.
having the good technique, really, it's not the whole of musicianship, but it's really a necessary part of it.
Right.
And that's related to this, isn't it? The kind of the daily practice of Bible reading. It's not that that's the problem.
Right. I think it's.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No.
Yeah, it's the spirit that you bring to it and what you think the technique itself will accomplish, and how you measure the efficacy of the technique, if we're thinking of it as a technique, and whether to some degree the person who reads scripture seeking spiritual growth, it seems to me part of the prerequisite is that you must submit yourself to scripture, right? That you have to lay yourself bare before it. You bring humility to it, and that's, I think, a very different way of conceiving of the matter than one that says, okay, here's my Bible reading plan. I have an app that's going to guide me through it. I'm going to check off every day that I accomplish this. I'm going to gamify spiritual life, and I'm going to become more spiritual, or I'm going to achieve a greater degree of sanctification, right? So a lot of it, I think, centers on the spirit one brings to the task. Yeah.
So the step-by-step method to accomplishing sainthood, or
right.
mastering Christianity, right?
10 steps to right.
Yeah. It's like using Babbel to gain language skills. Become a Christian in 15 minutes a day.
Right. Yeah, right. Exactly. And again, it's not that the practice itself is necessarily wrong or bad, and in fact, it may be a very helpful practice. But I think it's the assumptions that we bring to it, and what is framing it, right? Do I come to scripture each morning because I am prepared to be surprised by the voice of God in my life, recognizing that there are many days where it may feel like a very dry and cold exercise, but that there might be this one moment where, unbeknownst to me, in a place I did not look for it, God has spoken to me, right? Or do I think that I can simply call that up on demand by the exercise of the practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've sometimes said some of my students who want to master apologetics because they think this is right. This is the call of the gospel, to be able to convert people. And I sometimes think, if you think the call of the gospel is to win arguments, you might need to rethink what the call is. Right. Not that you shouldn't learn your apologetics, but
sure.
But yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah. So there's a section in this talk where you're talking about surveillance capitalism that I know was really interesting for a lot of people and brought up a lot of questions and thoughts and part of what's disturbing about it is that we can't get out of it. Mm-hmm. Right, we're not in a place to control those decisions, and it's so sort of around us, so pervasive. Well, this is part of your point, right? That this is not about particular devices, that this is a milieu that we live in. And one of the people in that discussion, I just wanted to share this comment with you because I thought it was so interesting, said they tried at one point to escape it, he and his family did, and this produced an incredibly regimented, controlling, and fearful form of life for them. Right? Because they had to police themselves so constantly, so carefully, be shutting down so much to try to get out of it. So I guess I kind of wonder, where then does that leave us, right? I mean, if we can't go the John Prine route of discipleship and blow up our TVs, right, and throw our papers, move to the country and find Jesus on our own, do you have examples, or can you tell us any stories about better ways to live, given that we live in this milieu, that we live in an environment that is forming us toward consumerism, that is forming us toward a path of kind of mastery and technique? Yeah,
in certain tech ethics circles, right, there's this opposition between the realization that the problem with techno-economic systems as they are presently constructed is that individual choice isn't going to solve the problem, right? You're not going to solve the climate crisis by recycling more of your paper, your glass, or your plastic, or whatever. And so that what is needed are systemic, often legislative, regulative actions, et cetera. And I think I just open with that because I think individual choices still kind of matter, right? Because it'd be very easy for me to say, well, if my choices don't matter, then I'll do whatever, right? And so saying that, I think it is true. You can't just sort of take yourself out of present society. Most of us don't have the liberty or even the desire, right, to move into some hermitage in the middle of nowhere beyond internet reach. But I think we can make decisions that are nonetheless valuable, right? That are meaningful. And so there's a lot of products that I would say just don't buy them. They're not good because they're going to feed this, and they're going to have consequences not just for you but for your neighbor, right? So an Amazon Ring doorbell, for example, comes to mind, or even many of the voice assistants that we bring into our homes. Most forms of sort of internet-connected devices that have apps, if we stop and think about it, have add no real value to our lives for being internet connected, right? Only add increasing vulnerabilities, but then also serve the function of being sort of vacuums of data for the sake of the algorithms, the predictive algorithms that will either later on be used to again continue to shape and mold the consumer subjectivity, or even in the case of something like the Ring camera, can be used in conjunction with unjust policing practices that will target minorities. The results of which will fall more towards minorities and to the kind of affluent people that tend to buy the Ring camera and do so for the sake of their convenience or security. And so I think that there are products we can meaningfully choose to opt out of. It's not going to solve the problem, right? There are other avenues that we would want to pursue, but my view in these sorts of questions is that you move on all fronts as far as possible. So yes, I'm not a legislative assistant. I'm not going to be crafting legislation. I might write my representative about some of these concerns, and so maybe have a voice in that arena. But at the end of the day, I think it is a lot of these large systemic issues they are large and systemic because the majority of the population sort of goes along with these patterns. And so, think again here, and forgive me for now thrice mentioning Ivan Illich. I think Ivan Illich recognized this. There has to be a fundamental reorientation of what constitutes the good life in the mass of people's hearts and minds. And yeah, that's not going to necessarily happen because I've become a more ethical consumer. In many cases, becoming a more ethical consumer just means that I have more wealth at my disposal. And so that, there are inequalities that are often exacerbated because of those kinds of decisions. So I think, again, it's a complicated issue that requires a great deal of sort of wisdom and judgment, reflecting upon one's own situation, one's spheres of influences. But what can be done ought to be done, I suppose would be the way I would frame it. And I'll mention that here and elsewhere, as I was thinking about some of these questions along the way, for me, the character of Daniel has been a great guide in terms of what it means to live in the world as an exile with a certain set of virtues and values, an idea of the good that is wildly at odds with what is the dominant culture, the dominant social patterns. And there is, I think part of what I find compelling in the case of Daniel is that he is able to navigate Babylonian society, the educational system, and to do so faithfully, to evidently serve other fellow human beings to whatever degree he's able, but he's able to drop it at a moment's notice, even at the cost of his own life, right? So to not be so captured in our hearts by these patterns that we are unable to just drop them, right, for the sake of what we recognize is a higher good. There's something in that posture that Daniel seems to bring to his career, at least as the narrative of Daniel presents him to us, that in my mind has always served as a good pattern for navigating what in many ways is a very similar position that many of us as Christians will find ourselves in, remaining faithful in an otherwise, in a dominant cultural environment that's very much at odds with what we think is good and true and beautiful.
Yeah. I just want to, it's really interesting. Now we set this gathering up this way, that the talk we were focused on yesterday, John Dyer's talk, we asked John to give a positive account. So it was pretty, that was his job. So
yeah,
pretty
right.
kind of optimistic approach. And we asked you to give the very critical approach. So we have the much more kind of critical approach today. That's what we wanted, to hear both of those voices. But it is interesting to me that there's a sense in which, as different as your approaches are, there is a kind of convergence toward the end, which is that really this is about a discerning use of the appropriate tools that can actually fit into and support Christian life, with an awareness that that's not everything is going to work for that, but it really does come down to making discernments about what actually is going to serve Christian life, not to conflate the two as though you're saying the same thing. But I think in that place it's interesting to see it. But I did want to raise one last question for you before I open it up to the rest of the gang, and that is this: that when I listened to the way you were talking in answer to that last question, this is where that kind of difference in tone really is very significant. That what you're asking us to attend to is this kind of being in exile and being in a dominant society that is in fact making it more difficult to adopt the path of grace. And a lot of us share that kind of concern. This is a group of people who, among whom a lot of people are thinking that way. But there is also this concern then that taking that approach in this moment especially toward digital technology, can have the effect then of just cutting us off, especially from a lot of the younger people in our lives. Not to sound like an old fogey, but I'm in my 50s now, so I am kind of an old fogey at this point. And there are things happening. There are lives being lived, and a search for God and acts of creativity and compassion happening in a digital world that I'm barely plugged into. And so I guess this is a kind of a last question I want to ask you. How do you imagine both preserving that sense that this is this is a dominant culture that makes the path of grace more difficult, that's forming us in a way that works against that, without closing ourselves off from brothers and sisters who are living full human lives and seeking God and so forth in that world.
Yeah, I think not bringing a sense of moral superiority to whatever might be the meaningful critique one offers, I think is critical. And I in contexts where I address these sorts of questions, I try to make that abundantly clear. I think we're all tempted by this, right? There are ways in which my own relationship with digital technologies is disordered. It is not what I want it to be, right? And so, if I were to assume this posture of I've got this figured out, all of this is bad, and you should be on it, then yeah, that would, I think, make it difficult to relate and connect when those opportunities might arise, or would be wise and prudential. So no, I don't think we should bring that attitude. I think we should be open to hearing the experience of others, and then likewise sharing whatever perspectives and wisdom we might have to bring to the matter. And also, I guess it's a question of where is this happening? Where's the intersection of this conversation? Where is this conversation situated? Right? Are we thinking about how I, as a parent, so I am in my 40s, so I have two very young, relatively young children, how I will relate to them when they're teenagers, or is it about how someone who is middle age or older might connect with the youth in their church, or is it about going on TikTok and trying to connect with the youth there? I think some of those are more profitable than others, and I think what I would encourage is the face-to-face relationship, right? And I think the places where we can combat the generational breakdown, one of those places is the church, right? And yet, here sliding slightly into my older ecclesial roles, one of the ways we have already kind of prevented that work from happening is by generationally segregating the life of the church. And so one of the ways that we can combat this is not necessarily by those of us who are older trying to do the rolling up the stone of Sisyphus, which is to try to keep up with the ever-changing milieu of what is cutting edge and where people are gravitating towards, but rather finding those people in our lives, in our families, in our congregations, where a meaningful relationship might open up, where elders in the church will be a part of the discipleship of the young, rather than outsourcing that to youth directors that will do that work for us and do so in the mode of relating to the youth. I was a youth pastor at some point, so I don't mean to speak very disparagingly here, but if the mode is just to always be relating to the young where they are, I'm not sure if that's the best framing of it. Not necessarily, Kelly, that's how you were putting it, but just again about how this can happen. I don't know that it's a matter of us trying to remain hip and up with the latest tools, but building meaningful context for meaningful relationship, intergenerational relationships within the church and within our homes.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That is, I think that opens up all kinds of areas for further discussion, I hope. So you all, we want to turn now to opening up the floor for other people that are on the call to raise their questions. Danny, would you like to take us into a question and answer period?
Sure. Right now we have 2 questions. So if others want to ask their questions, go ahead and chat them in, and I can see your name, and so we'll just call you up in order. So the first is Aaron, and I'll spotlight you.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. And I'm gonna, in a second, let you unmute yourself.
Great.
Okay, you can do it now.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, thanks, Danny. I was wondering, Michael, if you could comment on, I think a lot about the ways that we are interrogating our own authenticity and that the point of reference is really internal. But it can also, it seems to me, be connected to this concept of technique, right? So I have a technique of spiritual growth. There's lots of this abounding around spirituality, therapy as a technique, spirituality almost as a technique where I live. And I wondered if, and I'll just say, I've spent a lot of money on therapy and time. So it's not and I would hope that I have some robust spirituality and personal life. But I guess I'm wondering if you could comment on, do you think there's a connection between this culture of technology and kind of hyper autonomous individual development through techniques, or not? Is that something that's not really happening or connected?
Yeah, no, I would say that there is a, if we bring the assumption that for every, well, first of all, I would say, part of the issue here is how we frame the object that we're trying to achieve, right? So is it first of all, is it a problem, right? And what I mean by that is in the talk I referenced the danger of transforming death into a problem to be solved, right? And that's a line that it comes literally out of the work of Yuval Harari, who is projecting into the future, the possibility of life extension technologies. And there are not at all fringe academic centers that are focused on life extension, and whose frame of mind is that death is just an engineering problem to which we haven't, sufficiently brought our tools to bear. And so you frame a reality that we might be tempted to say, well, of course, death is a problem, but that's in a very unique way, right? Because that's in a problem that then must be solved, for which there is a solution, right? And then that what is required is the right set of techniques, or the right apparatus, or the right tools. And so if we are thinking of therapy in that way, right, if we think of the self, right, and the issues that we might face as a part of just being human in this world as a problem to be solved, and if that is and I have no animus to therapy in principle, right? This is not coming out of any sense that there is something wrong with therapy. It could be very helpful, but if the spirit that's animating is one where I have a set of technical problems, and it's just, and I'm a machine. The analogy is the self to the machine, right, or the brain to the machine, right? If I find the right cocktail of drugs, right, I'm gonna adjust the levels of my inner machinery just right. And again, that's not out of any opposition to the attempt to find medical techniques, or even pharmacology that can be helpful. Although I think it may encourage a degree of suspicion about the readiness with which we turn towards these sorts of solutions. And again, here, this is part of the diciness of the issue for me, is that I'm certainly not going to tell or prescribe to anybody and say to somebody who might seek my counsel in these matters, a family member, a friend, simply, you must accept suffering, right? De facto, as just a matter of principle. But I think we ought to raise the question of whether suffering is not indeed a kind of crucible of spiritual growth. Is it nothing but a problem to be overcome? And that if we can overcome it, we ought to at every point. It seems to me, and again, I'm not a theologian, or I wouldn't put myself in a position of speaking authoritatively, but it seems to me that runs counter to the way in which suffering is framed in the Christian tradition historically. And so if we have reduced the self to a problem to be solved, and therapy is our technique, I was like, yes, that is a problem. I think that's a dehumanizing way, frankly, of thinking about what the human being is and what our condition in this world is and our relation to God. And with regards to the question, you mentioned authenticity at the outset. And so I think that the question went a slightly different direction, but I'll say this about this struggle with authenticity. Media technology constructs the self to some degree, right? The self is constituted by some degree by the way we use technology. And then I mean by this even something like writing, right? Walter Ong, a great media ecologist, writes in Orality and Literacy that writing heightens consciousness and generates loads of irony in the self, because you're positioning yourself to some degree outside of the self, and so we become an object to ourselves in interesting ways. And of course, walking around with a camera does this to a degree that writing didn't even come close to approaching, right? In the sense that at every moment, it's very easy for the self that performs its reality through social media platforms to see life as a thing we direct rather than inhabit, right? We're always one remove outside of just the experience itself, right? Every moment is fodder for a future presentation of the self. And so I think that has this effect of generating a sense of inauthenticity in the individual. And there's a lot of literature about authenticity, et cetera. But I think that media ecological perspective certainly casts some light on why authenticity is such a holy grail of modern consciousness. And I hope that's helpful. And
Thanks.
Yeah.
Deborah has the next question. I'll put her up.
Thanks, Danny. Thank you, Michael, and Kelly, for a really rich conversation so far. Your insights, Michael, about the way of mastery are helpful to me in thinking about extractive industries. I live in Central Appalachia, a place that's been, desecrated and decimated by top removal and fracking and other ways of plundering the earth. And then, but also kind of connecting back to the brief mention earlier of the colonial project, which, justified plundering the earth with language that was both gendered and abhorrently violent. I mean, I think about Francis Bacon, who said something like, probe her, drive her, enter her. I mean, just astonishing.
Torture nature till she discloses her secrets.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So I'm just curious how, when you have, set this construct of the way of mastery, how much does gender and violence, and maybe the two of them together, factor into how you think about the ways we're tempted toward that kind of mastery when we're thinking about, the natural world in all kinds of settings and places?
I would say that I think I would be inadequate to answer that question fully, but even in the way you framed it, I would certainly assent to that there is a way in which the violence is evident. That is when nature becomes essentially raw material, and there's a theological history here. In the story of what we usually think of as disenchantment is a part of this, where what nature is, even in that, even in the move from language of creation to nature itself, but then also in sort of the way in which nature is conceived of as alive in more traditional societies, and even in earlier phases of Western history, and populated by spiritual realities. Christianity has some role to play, obviously, in changing that sort of mythopoetic landscape. But then even the loss of sort of the sacramental view of nature, where it is meaningful by virtue of the way in which it is a mode of God's speech to mankind. I'm Protestant, but I think that Protestantism has some role to play in this as well. And so that you eventually you've reduced nature to matter, right? And matter is it's just morally indifferent. It's just raw material. Heidegger's phrase, of course, is standing reserve. And that in some contexts, I think it has certainly been the case that especially the latter end of that process, has been abetted by framings that are gendered and are in many cases explicitly violent in their metaphorical, in their rhetorical presentation. But I have my own reading and research has not been very deeply informed by those kinds of critiques, and so I think others could answer that more adequately with more examples. But I'd certainly say that's been part of the story.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Reagan.
Hi. So my question has to do with how we as church communities who are working for, I guess, the good of our whole community, how we address questions of kind of the infrastructure of technology and how it's implemented in our communities. And I'm thinking of this because they're literally putting 5G towers on my street right now. Mm-hmm. And I talked to my neighbor. She's an elderly woman. They're putting one in her yard, and she didn't know about it until yesterday. And the concern isn't so much, there was no community input, nobody was notified. It's just happening. Yeah. And I'm also aware that this technology is coming in to create a different, to enable other technologies like self-driving cars. And I know that generations ago, cars fundamentally changed how we interact with our neighborhoods, mm-hmm. the way that street life was carried out, and so I wonder how we as church communities can address some of the kind of colonialist relationship that the tech companies are exercising in implementing some of these technologies without community input, or nobody got to say where it was the engineers who chose where the towers went, not the community. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I suspect that. So I'm not an activist, and I think the activist community would have a great deal more practical insight to offer on these questions. But I know that there have been successful community efforts to curtail surveillance technology. That is, and I think that's the area I'm most familiar with, the area of surveillance technologies. And so I think there have been successful grassroots efforts to curtail the use of surveillance technologies by police departments, or to have them deployed, by local communities or municipalities, and that has happened with people showing up at community meetings, whatever the particular political structure of the community might be, and voicing their opposition or raising awareness about. Certainly in the case of surveillance technology, the disproportionate harm that they bring to communities of color, to people of color. And so the dropping of a 5G tower on somebody's home without their awareness, I would suspect that at some point there must have been some, I guess the question would be, what is the deliberative process, right, that brought that to fruition? And where might there have been an intervention by community leaders, or by, even to some degree by church leaders, in order to prevent that kind of outcome? And very often it is the case that it seems as if you would be combating, daunting, powerful forces, right, that are just going to do as they will, and in some cases that might still be the case. But I think the practical question is to find out where the politics and the economics and the technology intersect in a way where there is a point at which a citizen might have a meaningful say, or might have some voice in that process. And I just don't think that, by and large, many of us have asked that. By us, I just sort of mean the Christian community, the comfortable Christian community that has not felt itself to be marginalized by society, has felt itself to be part of the dominant culture to some degree, maybe less so the case, which is generating a lot of angst and revealing a deep sense of entitlement, but that's a different story too. But there are communities that have been actively seeking to find ways to oppose these kinds of impositions. And so it would be a matter of listening and learning and finding those people who have been active in those kinds of projects.
Okay. Do we have other questions? There's none on the chat right now, but if we have time.
I can hop back in with one if there's time. If I get to ask more. Michael, do you have particular formative practices that you would recommend for Christian communities? You know, this is the Ecclesia Project, this gathering of you know, scholars and pastors and lay people who are particularly concerned about the life of the church. And so I'm wondering if there are things that you like to recommend for communities that might be helpful formative practices for growing in the path of grace. I was thinking about it. Inevitably, my mind latches on to the path of mastery, and I asked you a lot of questions about that. And so it might be a good idea to actually talk some. What does the path of grace look like?
That's a great question. I think fundamentally it's dispositional. You know, I cited Wendell Berry's line from one of the Sabbath poems, right? We live the given life, not the planned. And I think it involves a growing attempt to understand the various ways in which the spirit of control has seeped into our day-to-day existence. And I think this will vary person to person, family to family, community to community. You know, I think of it as a father. A lot of this sort of comes to a point with regards to how I, you know, bring up my two girls, where there's so much, for example, of the industry that is encouraging us to monitor our children relentlessly, right? Alan Jacobs has a wonderful line in which he talks about how surveillance has become a normative form of care. You know, he tells the story of a couple, I think it was in Virginia, that were arrested for letting their children walk their way home from school unattended, and they were trying to teach them to navigate, you know, their way through the community to be safe. They actually were involved in the whole process, but they weren't watching them right that second, and so that becomes, in the eyes of the state, negligence. And so and that's just one example of the ways in which we're encouraged to micromanage every aspect of a child's life. You know, I've often sort of talked about the professionalization of childhood. The film version of The Little Prince that came out a few years back is a wonderful example of that, and I encourage you to watch that touching movie and to read the book if you haven't. But to look at ways in which we, you know, again, in our day-to-day life are motivated. If we ask ourselves the question, why am I doing this, or why am I not doing this? Why am I bringing this technology into my household? What do I hope to achieve by it? What will it do? How will it restructure my my experience of, again, and you know, for me, childhood's top of mind. You know, my experience of being a parent, right? So, you know, if I have an app that can, you know, track my teenager's movements from, you know, the time he leaves the house to the time he gets back. Technologies mediate perception. How is that technology mediating my relationship to my child? It's offering itself as a way of alleviating the anxiety of the parent, right, who always worries about, you know, the well-being of the child. But what else is happening? If this has not been the norm, why hasn't it been the norm, right? You know, how did children survive before this? You know, I think a lot of times it's so easy, I think, to allow the milieu to just construct for us, you know, a sense of what is normal or what must be the case, and to eliminate for us options of other modes of life, other ways of ordering our lives. And so to just be aware of how the introduction of a new technology may reshape our relationships, our experience of our day-to-day lives, and what assumptions they bring with them, right? What they encourage us, how they encourage us to see our relationships, to see our experience. And I think just that kind of awareness is itself a kind of discipline, right? It is a kind of spiritual practice. And then to become more intentional, right, about the technologies that we allow to achieve this role in our lives, to the degree that we have the freedom to make those kinds of choices. And then, but I think the key thing is to keep in mind the good after we, the good we seek, because too often I think these kinds of conversations turn into a set of prohibitions, right? This amount of screen time and no more, or no screens before this, or only this much television. And so you're just focused on these negatives. And I think the key is to keep in mind the good that we seek, right? It is good for me to be able to see the world because God speaks to me through the world. But if I'm unattentive, if I've not cultivated the spiritual discipline of attentiveness to the world, in part because my capacity for attention has been shaped by my consumption of digital media, then it's not that, the problem is not screen time per se, right? The problem is that now I have undermined my capacity to achieve this good that I ought to value for its own sake, right? And so to go back one more time to the example of Daniel, my view of Daniel's choice to abstain from the king's food, the king's table in the opening chapter, is that it was absolutely arbitrary, that it had nothing to do with Levitical laws, it had nothing to do with political ritual. It was an absolutely arbitrary decision, but that it was, in its arbitrariness, an anchor of Daniel's identity, right? It was the one thing he would do that would order his sense of self, his sense of identity. And so I think that there is great value in just simple rituals that we might create for ourselves. I was recently listening to Andy Crouch. Andy Crouch has I think, written very insightfully about questions of technology in the Christian family. And he described this one ritual that he has been practicing for some time, which is that he will not touch his smartphone until he has gone outside. And that may mean standing in his porch for a few seconds, or that may mean, sitting outside for a longer period of time or walking outside. But there's nothing inherently virtuous about the practice per se, and you're not a bad person if you don't do this, but it is for him a way of centering his experience of the day, right? Of not allowing the flood of information to immediately dictate the emotional and cognitive texture of the day. And as he puts it, to remind himself of his creatureliness by being attentive to the world, the non-human built world, to whatever degree we have access to that, right? And so I think there's great freedom and a room for creativity in the cultivation of practices, counter practices that would sustain a clearer view of the good that we seek and help ingrain that in us. And to the language of counter practices is Albert Borgmans, another wonderful Christian critic of philosopher of technology, critic of technology. And these practices are a kind of counterbalance to the ones that we are necessarily needing to engage ourselves in, and may give us the degree of critical distance from those practices so that we can, to some degree, curb their formative influence and allow the formative influences to come from the realms of grace, as it were, right? But the Spirit is very pervasive, and I think it's in us all, right? To control, to master, to avoid all forms of suffering, to turn to technique rather than to prayer. And so, yeah, there's, in my view, at least in my own heart, a lot of work always to be done.
Kelly, you're muted.
And I could have said that, I'm sorry.
It had to happen, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you for being patient with me. I'm just gonna thank you. That was helpful. I just want to kind of flag for myself, and I'll mention this for other people, what I'm recognizing as a theme that's appeared now and again in these talks, some things that are connected to disability studies. When we talk about the given life, not the planned life, right? And a discerning use where we recognize there are tools that can be helpful, and there are tools that can be about replacing or fixing a person in a way that actually denies the givenness of the person, right? And so I think there's a lot to explore there, maybe about the church's hospitality to human fragility and to people who don't fit the model of what we expect the able-bodied person to be, which these days fits me. As I say, I'm getting older, so these my temporarily able-bodied status has been revealed recently.
I'll mention Sarah Hendren. The name of her book now is escaping, but it's her latest book. It's a wonderful book on just this question. She's the mother of a disabled child and is also a theorist of design and an artist. And so I wish I could remember right now the name of her book, but it came out last year. It's by Sarah Hendren. And on that particular topic, I would certainly recommend it. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Danny, do we have one last question, or are we wrapping up?
We have no more questions, and we're at about time.
We are at about time. I just didn't want to have hogged up the last question. Well, thank you, Michael, so much for being with us today. This has been really helpful. You guys, if everybody wants to switch into gallery view and give Michael a round of applause in whatever way you can, shake your hands, make your face, bring your dog onto the screen, whatever, good. So Michael, you're very appreciated. We thank you for your effort and for the expertise you bring to this, and glad to have you as part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Or to maybe someday actually having you in the Polynesian room with us, the actual Polynesian room. Although if you'd like to be in the one tonight, that would be fun too.
Thank you so much, and it was a pleasure. And again, it was a surprise out of nowhere to get the email inviting me to this, and so it was a very welcome development, and I'm glad that I was able to make that work. And thank you all. This has been a wonderful experience from beginning to end. Yeah.
Okay, so that's great. And just a note to everybody, remember that there is. Wait, remind me who's got the schedule in front of them, because I don't. There is the social tonight, which starts at, is that 8 o'clock Eastern?
9 Eastern.
9 o'clock Eastern. Okay, and what comes before that?
The movie discussion on the social dilemma.
Okay, right. So check in on your info sheet there, same Zoom link to get to the movie discussion, and then the different Zoom link to get to the social tonight. And it'll be great to see you guys there. Okay, blessings on everybody. We'll catch you again soon. Thank you, Michael.